بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما تعلمنا وزدنا من فضلك علما وعملا وقربا يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم زدنا ولا تنقصنا وأكرمنا ولا تهنا وأعطنا ولا تحرمنا وآثرنا ولا تؤثر علينا وأرضنا وارض عنا يا أرحم الراحمين ويا أكرم الأكرمين. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we've been looking at Surah Al-Baqarah, and alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we've almost reached the end of it. And so the discussion has been about spending in the way of Allah and charity, and then we had to look at the opposite of charity, in essence riba. And generally, when is riba attained and how is it acquired? It's through loans, it's debt. People get into debt and they're forced to pay back more than what they borrowed. So we looked at the ayah about فَنَظِرَةٌ إِلَى مَيْسَرَةٍ, that it's better to give. If the person who's borrowed the money can't pay, then delay the collection of the payment until a time of ease, until a time where things have become easy for the person. So now what we look at is the ayah to Dain. And then, so there was this discussion about the Day of Judgment, just to summarize the seriousness of this. But the topic returns about debt, and this is the longest ayah in the Qur'an, right? The longest ayah and it's about debt, and we can't do it justice, not in the time frame that that we have, but we'll go over it. And many of the ulama have discussed this ayah in detail, and so what we'll do is we'll highlight some of its aspects, and we show, we'll see how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has laid out the foundations of justice, laid out the foundations of good sound transactions that don't lead to arguments, right? That's one of the principles in the Sharia, that we want to prevent arguments and disputes over financial transactions, and a lot of the rulings in the Sharia do revolve around this. So we see this, and we'll see how beautifully Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us these rulings in a way that anyone can understand them, yet there's depth to them, there's nuance to them, and there's wisdom. It's based on His supreme wisdom, and there's a lot of detail in this. And the fuqaha and the ulama have talked at length about this ayah on its own. And so there's there's a clear indication of the wisdom and the beauty of the laws of Islam. And many of the ulama talk about al-i'jaz al-tashri'i, that the miraculous legislation in the Quran, and how it deals with the human being on many levels, right, and society on many levels. So without any further ado, let's start. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala starts the ayah with يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل مسمى فاكتبوه وليكتب بينكم كاتب بالعدل. O believers, when you contract a loan for a fixed period of time, commit it to writing. Let the scribe maintain justice between the parties. So let's see how much we can cover in this session. But it starts with Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. So there's an address, especially after the previous discussions. O you who believe. So he's calling us with honor, is honoring us with this address, and he's calling us to look at the look at the ruling that he's going to give us with the quality of being believers. So Allah has told us this, there's our benefit in it. Okay, I'm going to hear what he says, I'm going to try to do it as best I can. That's the attitude, right? So Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu. Then he said idha tadayantum, when you contract a loan, or when you take out a loan, when you take a loan, or when you give a loan, or the tadayana is like a mutual two-way loan, lending and receiving and borrowing process. But then he said bidaining, with a loan, right? So when you deal with each other with a loan, why is this? um, there's a couple of reasons the ulama mentioned. One of them is that firstly, the word tadayana, tadain, is tadayana can also be related to, for example, to the word deen, which is like a judgment, right? And or a final decisive judgment. So there are other ways of, so one of them is, as Abu Saud mentions, but it can really relate to other sort of transactions, right? So he specifies specifically bidain, right? When you deal with each other, with debt, right? And we'll leave it at that. But there's also the point that Sayyid Tantawi mentions, bidainin ila ajalin musamma, that when you lend each other money, or when you deal with each other in terms of borrowing and lending with a debt, ila ajalin musamma, which is until a fixed period. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has uh, addressed the believers saying, okay, when you're going to borrow and lend money, and it's up to a fixed point. So you borrow money of someone and he says you have to pay back to me, in 6 months, for example. So we understand from this is permissible, and we also understand from this that it's also permissible to to borrow money, which can be taken at any point. So there's two types of debt. So you can borrow money of someone. So can you lend me £50 and I'll pay back to you, right? And whoever has asked, whoever lends the money can ask for it at any time. But then there's another type of debt, which is there's a fixed term that, can you lend me this much money? I'll pay you in a month, in a year, or however long it may be. And so that has, I think, although it's best to follow these instructions in and write it down, but generally when there's a term to a debt, that's where things could likely go wrong, more likely, because time can pass and people can forget, or someone could change the details and say, well, I don't owe you this much, it was actually much less, or the lender can say, no, it was actually much more, and so on. So this is Sayyidina Abdullah ibn Abbas. He felt that there's a chapter in fiqh called Kitab al-Salaf, Bab al-Salaf, where it's basically, um, it's a sale where you make payment and then you're going to collect in a few months time or whatever. It has these particular conditions. He felt that this ayah was relating to that, but the majority of the ulama and Mufassirun said no, it relates to debt as it is. And what is debt? It's any sort of transaction where someone gives cash, and from the other party there is a responsibility to pay off that cash, right? So either as soon as possible or after a fixed period of time. So he said, إذا تداينتم بدين إلى أجل, right, to a fixed point. And the word ajal, we've looked at it before, and it can mean many things. It can mean the end point, right, the date it's due. It can mean the actual term, or it can mean just before the end point. We looked at it when we were looking at divorce. And so he said to ila ajalin musamma, right, an ajal which is stated, like you explicitly state it, which means that you should come to an agreement beforehand. All of these things before you go, when you go into financial transactions, uh, as the ulama say, that even if it's with people that are close to you, be friends, be relatives, be brothers, sisters, whatever. But if you're going to go into financial transactions where you could lose, then treat each other as strangers. Which meaning that if you were to have a financial transaction with someone who you don't know, you're going to write everything down clearly, right? So both sides write everything down, and they're happy with all the details. Right, let's progress. Right, so this ensures that no one is wronged. Yeah. So ila ajalin musamma. So it's mentioned, it's stated, so both parties agree on it, right? So he said faktubuhu. So if you lend each other money, or when you contract a loan for a fixed period of time, I'm not here to give the world's best translation of the Quran. I try to just clarify and expand on the meanings, and although I do comment on this translation at times. When you contract a loan for a fixed period of time, faktubuhu, right? Then write it down, commit it to writing, right? And why? Because um, when you write it down, you've documented it, so it's not just as I say, gentleman's agreement. It's not just a promise you've made, or an agreement you made one afternoon somewhere off, in the city, where no one knows about it, no one can be held accountable. So that's one benefit. The second benefit is that the actual amount is also precisely stated, right? It's this much money, right, which has been borrowed, and this much, the same amount will be repaid. So it's it's in the past, obviously there were no receipts. Right now, you can buy something from a store and they'll email you a receipt and it's there, so there's the transaction has been documented. So we have witnesses, in the Sharia, for majority of history. That's been the way of documenting things as well as writing it down. So it's just another way of uh, confirming that a transaction has occurred, the precise amount of the transaction, and it also prevents any sort of argument and disputation between them, right? So he said, "Faktubuhu," then write it down, meaning the debt, the amount, right? And which also uh, the pronoun faktubuhu goes back to the word, refers to the word dain. So that would include both categories, whether it's a long-term delayed payment or it's an immediate payment, right? But especially for the long term, as the ayah highlights, because you're more likely to forget, or there's more likely to be some cause of disputation, right? And so it also says ajalin musamma, a fixed term, so that you know exactly when it is, right? You don't say, okay, lend me the money, I'll pay you back when things get better, right? Or as some of the Arabs would say, for example, I'll pay you back when the people return from Hajj. People that have gone to Hajj, now it might be a small time frame. When the Hajj is over, they might go to Medina, spend a few days there, come back. Usually, people come back between a fortnight, 3 weeks, a month after Hajj. But in the past, people would go and they'd walk there or ride there and spend their time there, and then they come back. They could come back a year after they set off, right? They could come back, they could arrive home a year after the Hajj finishes. So it's not clear, right? So a clear specific date. When it comes to financial transactions, everything should be absolutely crystal clear, right? This prevents arguments, right? So the majority of the ulama said that this verse uh, is for nadab, right? It's mustahab. It's highly recommended to do this. Is it obligatory? No, right? It's not obligatory. You're not sinful, but it's highly recommended that you do. If you get a loan or something, that you write it down, so it's all clearly stated, right? So there's no questions. There were some of the ulama of Islam, al-Zahiriyah. They were literalists, right? And generally they interpreted the text of the Quran and the Sunnah absolutely literally, right? So they said no, it's wajib, you have to do it. But the majority of scholars said no, it's not that. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلْيَكْتُبْ بَيْنَكُمْ كَاتِبٌ بِالْعَدْلِ, right? And وَلْيَكْتُبْ is the command, right? So he's commanding a writer uh, write between them with justice, right? You could say. So what does this mean? Firstly, writing historically hasn't been something that everyone is capable of, but people are in need of financial transactions, and so most people engage in financial transactions, men, women, adults, even children, right? But not everyone has had the ability or the opportunity to learn how to read and write. So here it's it's a social responsibility. It's a duty that whoever can write should write. It's a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If there's people that if there's people that are engaging in a transaction, then you help them by writing that transaction down for them, right? وَلْيَكْتُبْ بَيْنَكُمْ كَاتِبٌ. And so the ulama say that this writer, it should be someone that's aware of the conditions of the Sharia, right? Aware of the so which it's not, you don't have to become an expert in the fiqh of trade, right? There are matters that are nuanced, and especially contemporary matters, and you go to the ulama and you ask them. But there are basic matters of trade, buying and selling, what is allowed, what is not allowed, loans, debts, interest, these sorts of things, basic matters. Every Muslim should be aware of these, right? You should take some time out and learn your deen. Generally, what happens, people fall into problems when they've neglected this element, right? And had they been prepared, they would have been able to avoid certain things, right? In matters like this, matters of inheritance, these sorts of things. So go and learn it first, beforehand. So so they say that ideally someone that knows the fiqh of these matters, he can identify, well, no, this is interest and this is another problematic element or whatever. So someone like that. And so he says, وَلْيَكْتُبْ بَيْنَكُمْ كَاتِبٌ بِالْعَدْلِ. And then so the ulama mentioned that, he mentioned بَيْنَكُمْ, between you two, right? So meaning that the writer should be there, he should be present in the presence of both witnesses, both parties, right? He shouldn't go off with one party alone and write the document down and say, look, I've taken care of it. Maybe the other person can't read, right? And so it has to be, so every step is taken to ensure that the transaction is carried out in complete fairness, right? So let the writer do this. بينكم كاتب بالعدل. And then once again Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala clearly stipulates, with fairness. And this ba is the ba of mulabasa, which means something being wrapped in another thing. So you could say, him being, if justice and fairness was a blanket, he'd wrap himself up in it as he's writing, right? So there's no way any sort of injustice or wrongdoing can come into this dealing, right? So he shouldn't go off alone with any of them or have any sort of partial treatment of either party. No, be completely fair and do your duty and right. And and so there's fairness in this matter. No one loses out, right? And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says wala, so let's look at the ayah. ولا يأبى كاتب أن يكتب كما علمه الله فليكتب. The scribe should not refuse to write as Allah has taught them to write. وَلْيُمْلِلِ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِ الْحَقُّ وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهَ رَبَّهُ وَلَا يَبْخَسْ مِنْهُ شَيْئًا. They will write what the debtor dictates, bearing Allah in mind and not defrauding the debt. Okay, excellent. So let's look at this. وَلَا يَأْبَ كَاتِبٌ أَنْ يَكْتُبَ. So the scribe, so there's two ways to interpret this verse. And so the first way is he's saying what the translation says: the scribe should not refuse to write as Allah has taught him to write. So فَلْيَكْتُبْ, so he should write, right? And so he should write فَلْيَكْتُبْ, full stop. And then, although that's not included in the translation, وَلْيُمْلِلِ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِ الْحَقِّ. The translation doesn't quite align with the Arabic, but okay. So there's two ways. One is saying the writer should write because Allah has taught him to write, right? So وَلْيَكْتُبْ بَيْنَكُمْ كَاتِبٌ بِالْعَدْلِ وَلَا يَأْبَ كَاتِبٌ أَنْ يَكْتُبَ كَمَا عَلَّمَهُ اللَّهُ. And so the writer should not refuse to write because Allah has taught him, right? So the meaning there would be, Allah has taught you, so because you have this responsibility, don't refuse. When you're called to write, you must, you should write this, then document the transaction. That's the first interpretation. The other interpretation, which I feel is stronger, it works better with it, is Allah is saying وَلَا يَأْبَ كَاتِبٌ أَنْ يَكْتُبَ, that no writer should refuse to write. So the ulama say that if you're in this situation, it's obligatory on you to write, unless there's someone else. If you can't do it, there's someone else available. But if there's no one else available, you must step forward and write this document, right? You document this transaction. So that's one way of looking at it. And then, so what does it mean? So what does it mean? كما علمه الله فليكتب. So he, just as Allah has taught him, he should write. Let him write. Make write. So this works better. I feel that they're both valid interpretations. But this one is saying, just as Allah has taught him to write, let him write. What does it mean? So just as Allah has done him the favor of teaching him how to write, Allah has facilitated the means for him to be able to learn how to read and learn how to write. And it was a favor. Not everyone has this blessing, right? And so just as Allah did a favor to him and taught him how to write, something he benefits from continuously over and over throughout his life, then in the same way he should do these people a favor and write. So just as Allah has taught him how to write, he should write for them. So it's highlighting the favor of Allah. Just as Allah did him the favor and bestowed this blessing on him of teaching him how to write through people, then he should write like them. He should do others a favor and write like this. So that's what he's saying. So that's the writing part covered. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ensured everything is written. It's written clearly with fairness, and the person who writes is impartial. He doesn't have any sort of physical partiality. Doesn't go off alone with one party to write it. Everyone's there, everyone's present, and he should step forward and do this service because what does it lead to? It leads to the people's rights being preserved and maintained, and so that's a huge service, right? So just how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught him, and done that favor to him, he should do that favor, right? And then the ayah continues. He says, وَلْيُمْلِ لِلَّذِي عَلَيْهِ الْحَقُّ. So, and here's also a command. So yumlil, so this is imlal, and there's another version of this word you could say is imla. Same word, same meaning. So imla is dictation, right? So الذي عليه الحق, the one on top of whom is this right. So it's as though that the debt that he owes is sat on top of him, it's weighing him down, and he has to discharge it when he returns it. So he is the one who's burdened with it. So the debtor, so the one who this burden, the debt is on top of, should dictate, right? وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهَ رَبَّهُ وَلَا يَبْخَسْ مِنْهُ شَيْئًا. Let him fear Allah, his loving Lord, and not diminish anything from it. So what does this mean? So he says that the person who owes the money should dictate the amount. So they're all stood there. We're going to talk about that. There should be witnesses here. So the person who's lending the money, the person who's borrowing the money, the writer, and the witnesses, right, are all present. And the person who's borrowing the money has to dictate it. I, so and so, I'm borrowing such and such an amount from so and so, and he's given me 6 months to pay it, so I will pay him on this particular date, right? The last the last day of Ramadan, or the 14th day of Ramadan, or however, right? So he specifically stated it. So so he says وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهَ رَبَّهُ, and let him fear Allah. So don't try and rip him off, and don't try and do something that would cause the other person to lose his right in some way, shape, or form. Don't do any of that. Rather fear Allah, your Lord, and do this. وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهَ رَبَّهُ. And so وَلَا يَبْخَسْ مِنْهُ شَيْئًا, and don't diminish anything of it. And instead of saying, oh yeah, you're borrowing 10,000, yes, I borrowed 9,000, or it's just something like that. Just either something really obvious or even a small amount. Don't وَلَا يَبْخَسْ مِنْهُ شَيْئًا, not a slight amount, not the slightest amount, nothing at all. What you owe, you declare, right? And the benefit of this is everyone's present, and the person who's speaking now, who's dictating, the person who's borrowing the money, is saying, I have borrowed this amount. So in one sense he's admitting, and there's a whole chapter in fiqh about this, kitab al-iqrar, where the person admits, I owe so and so money, and there's consequences to this. So he's making a declaration, an admission of owing money to this person, and at the same time, if he is incorrect in stating the amount, uh, then the person who the lender can speak up at that point. No, it's not that, it's this, right? So it can be clarified at that point, and whilst it's written down. So he doesn't diminish anything, and so what does he do? He doesn't diminish anything. The lender can't later claim, well, it's a larger amount, because you could say to him, when the documentation is produced, well, hang on, he said it's this much in front of you and you didn't say anything, you agreed, so how can you now claim he borrowed more of you? So it prevents, and the person who's borrowing also has to admit publicly that I owe him money. So he's made the admittance, he can't diminish the amount, and the lender can't increase the amount. Can you see, subhanAllah, there's a lot, that's going through, the wording. So it's really beautiful, legislation here. Neither party is wronged, right? And subhanAllah, neither party is wronged in any way. So then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and then he says, وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهَ رَبَّهُ, be fear of Allah, have fear of Allah, the supreme name, because you don't want to, the supreme being of complete majesty and perfection, you don't want to get on the wrong side of him, right? Allah protect us. And then he also says, رَبَّهُ, he's your Lord, he's been doing all these favors for you, he's been looking after you, he's given you the money, he's facilitated this debt for you, and to borrow the money, he'll facilitate his payment, his repayment. So just beware, right? And don't lose sight don't lose sight of who's looking after who, and who's been providing for who. Just keep that in mind, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take care of the matter for you, right? So it's very clear. And so he says, وَلْيَتَّقِ اللَّهَ رَبَّهُ. And then the ayah continues. It says, فَإِنْ كَانَ الَّذِي عَلَيْهِ الْحَقُّ سَفِيهًا أَوْ ضَعِيفًا أَوْ لَا يَسْتَطِيعُ أَنْ يُمِلَّ فَلْيُمْلِلْ وَلِيُّهُ بِالْعَدْلِ. So he says, so if the person upon whom is the right, meaning the debt, right, the haqq is the right, and the right belongs to the person who's lending the money. So at this point he's borrowed the money, so it's on him, right? It's on his debt, on his shoulders, you could say. If he's a safi, if he's incompetent, or you could say, if he's not intelligent, أو ضعيفا, or if he's weak, أو لا يستطيع أن يمل, and he's unable to dictate, فليملل وليه بالعدل, then let his wali, his appointed guardian or his appointed representative, dictate bil adl, with justice and fairness once again, right? So what does it mean? So فإن كان الذي عليه الحق سفيها, and so either he's he is ignorant, not in an offensive way, but he's ignorant in the sense that he doesn't know the rulings in these matters. He doesn't know like how precisely to dictate something. People have generally like, you have to look at this as a ruling laid out for the generality, and is to benefit the masses, right? And so people are on different levels of intelligence, of education, of experience. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is clarifying it for everyone. So those who can do it yourselves. If you can't, for various reasons, one of them is someone's a safi, he's not intelligent, right? He's not intelligent, or it could be, for example, someone that's not wise with money, right? Like any money he gets, he blows, right? So in the Sharia, that that there's there are rulings in place to protect his money, to protect him from wasting all of his money. So either someone like that, so he's he's safi, like, so he's not intelligent, um and or he doesn't know how to use his money well, or da'if, or someone who's weak, in the sense that he's vulnerable, right? Either someone who's really old, the mental faculties are not there completely, or someone who's really young, a child. Yes, children can engage in certain financial transactions, not every financial transaction. There's rulings in the Sharia for that. So but if a child, like for example, he's, you know, let's say there's an orphan, he's got some money, and an opportunity comes, um, and he should buy, say, a plot of land or a building, and it will help him, it'll be good for him in the long term. His guardian, his legal guardian advises, you know, that we should buy it. So technically it's a child that's buying it. He might not have all the money, so he might go and borrow some money of someone, so it's him who's carrying out the transaction. But yet, because he is inexperienced, right, potentially vulnerable, then he's appointed guardian, right? He's wali, and wali is generally your closest male relative, uh, for ladies in terms of marriage and these things and like this. But it can, you know, it can be anyone who, you know, that's been appointed. But you know, there has to be adl, you know, the person has to do it with fairness and justice, and you know, he has to have, he has to be on the lookout for the benefit of this child or this person or this, you know, person who's not capable of doing it himself. So he dictates everything perfectly as it is, because you know, saying that the person who's borrowing the money has to dictate, well, if he says something wrong or makes a mistake, the others can catch him out. If he makes a mistake that would end up harming the lender will catch him out, other people catch him out. If he makes a mistake harming, that could end up, you know, harming himself by saying, say for example, more than what is actually borrowed, then it's not likely, right? But most people would catch up on that. But if the person is not capable of doing this, um, then what do you do? Then you have a representative, and he has to ensure that he's doing it right with fairness and justice, right? So فَلْيُمْلِلْ وَلِيُّهُ بِالْعَدْلِ. Or there's also the category of someone who's unable to. So for example, someone that can't speak, all he knows is sign language, for example, and most people don't speak sign language, right? Or they can't interact with sign language. So you know, he has a representative there who knows exactly what's going on, and they together, together do this, and they make sure, they ensure that there's justice and fairness for all parties. No one is to be wronged. So so that's pretty much half of the ayah. What we'll do, we'll stop it here, and then we'll continue with the other half of the ayah, inshallah ta'ala, um, next time. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.